Good evening, everyone. Okay, so those of you who've been you can find a seat. There's a couple open seats here in the middle, and then over on the sides too. And then if you haven't yet, if you could take a second and silence your cell phones, that would be great. And if you haven't gotten pizza yet, it will still be here when you leave, so it's okay.
Oh, I was going to ask you to smile.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening. My name is Amelia James. I am one of the co-presidents for the Alexander Hamilton Society chapter here at AU. My other co-president is studying abroad in Chile right now, so he's with us in spirit. Thank you so much for coming out to our first event of the year on countering Chinese aggression. And we hope to see you at our following events throughout the whole school year. We'll be hosting events on and off, so please be on the lookout. These will be social events and formal events like this. Our next one is our kickoff open house next week, Wednesday, September 18th, from 8 to 9 in the Don Myers building on East Campus, room 111. So be on the lookout for more information and mark your calendars for that. Tonight, you will hear perspectives from two distinguished speakers, moderated by one of SIS's own professors on Southeast and East Asia, all of whom we're honored to have with us tonight. I'll begin by introducing both of our speakers and our moderator before passing it over to them. First, we'd like to welcome to AU's campus Mr. Dan Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal has spent the past more than a decade serving in and advising on issues relating to this region. From 2001 to 2004, he served as Senior Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the U.S. Department of Defense. He then served as a commissioner on the congressionally mandated U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission from 2006 to 2012, and in 2007 held the position of Vice Chairman. He served on the Academic Advisory Board of the Congressional U.S.-China Working Group, and he's the co-author of the book An Awkward Embrace, the United States and China in the 21st Century, published in 2012. He currently serves as the Director of Asian Studies at the American Enterprise Institute here in Washington. Next, I would like to introduce one of our own, Professor Miles Kahler from American School of International Service. Dr. Kahler is a distinguished professor who is an expert in international politics and international political economy. He became a senior fellow for global governance at the Council on Foreign Relations in 2014 and maintains that role today. As a senior fellow, he has completed projects on the competitive and complementary relations between global and regional institutions, innovation on global governance, and international efforts to combat illicit financial flows. He's been published many times in his career, and previously he held fellowships at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Science at Stanford University from 2007 to 2008, and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars from 2012 to 2013. Finally, we have Professor Koon Heng serving as our moderator this evening. Dr. Heng teaches and researches in fields of identity politics, ethnic relations, governance, and economic development, particularly in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. She also has interest in ASEAN, regionalism in East Asia, and free trade arrangements in this region. She's been published many times on issues relating to these topics and currently runs the Insular Southeast Asia Advanced Area Studies program at the State Department Foreign Service Institute. Here at AU, she teaches classes on international relations and international political economy in Southeast and East Asia. Over the summers, she directs the School of International Service's graduate program on globalization and regionalism in East Asia in Malaysia. Thank you to all of our participants for being here this evening. And for our audience, we ask that you listen to all of what is said and save all of your questions for the end, when there will be a Q&A session with the speakers. And now I will turn it over to Professor Heng.
Thank you, Lydia. Can you hear me? Great. So thank you for inviting me to moderate this session with our two distinguished panelists. And so I would like to just kick this off by posing this question, how do you define aggression? And to what extent do you agree with the premise of this topic? And And then moving on to look at the issue areas, how is this question, if there's a question, how is it manifested in the security strategic dimension, so South China Sea, East China Sea, the economic dimension, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, the activities of Huawei and artificial intelligence, 5G, Chinese initiatives in those areas, and the US-China trade war. How do you see any manifestation of aggression in that realm? And third, in the political dimension, as demonstrated by developments in Hong Kong. And fourth, its manifestations in China's engagement in multilateral institutions. Do you see any manifestations of aggression? UN, WTO, AIIB, AHS Summit, ASEAN, ASEAN Plus 3. And finally, what are US and other countries doing to counter such perceived transgressions? So each speaker will have 12 minutes each to make his case, and then another 5 minutes to respond to the other speaker. So, and the panel discussion should end at 7:50. We'll devote the last 3 minutes to a Q&A session and wrap up by about 8:15. So, who would like to? Okay, so Mr. Blumenthal, yeah, would you like to make your case?
So, can everyone hear me? Okay. So, in 12 minutes, you want me to cover that?
You have
All that ground.
and then you have another 5 minutes.
Okay,
To
good.
defend your case.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to the Hamilton Society, of which I am actually a co-founder back in 2010. And it's great to see it's so active with such great peers and professors that are engaged and so forth. And this is exactly, I think, what we envision in terms of having some debates about policy issues across college campuses. So I do see China, or China under the Chinese Communist Party's one-party rule as aggressive. I see it as aggressive towards the Chinese people. I see it as aggressive towards the regional neighbors, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, some extent Indonesia. I see it as aggressive in its pursuit of its national interests in pushing back the United States' own strategic policy and strategic posture inside the Asia Pacific as well. So I see it as an aggressor. I think I would define aggression against your own people as things like putting maybe over 1 million ethnic Uyghurs in de-radicalization, quote-unquote, internment camps, not allowing them to practice the Muslim religion, and not allowing and using the tools of a richer, China's not yet rich, I'll talk about that as well, but as a richer state, powerful tools of surveillance and genetic testing and artificial intelligence in order to create a massive database on is used for reasons of persecution as well. I think China's become more aggressive and repressive against its own people, actually, than I've ever seen it since the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989. I'd say in the 1980s there was a little bit more room for cultural, intellectual pluralism, maybe even up to 2012 when Xi Jinping took power. But now there's a massive crackdown on all forms of cultural expression, intellectual expression, political dissent, religious expression. So I do see that as aggressive, and I think many Chinese people see that as aggressive as well. If you move sort of from the core of China itself into the periphery, I think actions in Hong Kong are not as aggressive yet as they might become in the next few weeks. Are quite aggressive in terms of, well, let's just say undermining or not living up to contractual and treaty promises that the Chinese made both to the Hong Kong people and the British, such as not giving the Hong Kong people universal suffrage, which was promised beforehand, not as physically aggressive again as they might become, but certainly setting the conditions for physical aggression to put down these protests. I think Chinese activities towards Taiwan, maybe the right word I would use is coercive, which is a form of aggression. It's not occupying, but the isolation of Taiwan diplomatically, type of military exercises that China engages almost on a daily basis around Taiwan Strait to intimidate its people to vote in a certain pro-China direction, democratically held elections, things like cyber attacks, espionage, political influence campaigns. Taiwan is the victim of those almost on a daily basis. I would define aggression in the near seas, the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Can you give me a little more? 4 minutes or something. Okay. We're now 2/3 done. I would define the harassment of Vietnamese and Filipino fishing and oil exploration vessels. They're going back to the early aughts, if not before, because of maritime disputes over maritime rights and territorial claims, as aggressive, as well as the building or reclamation, they call it the dredging and building of 3,000 acres of new territory and putting military outposts on many of them, and disputed island chains of the Spratly Island and Parasol Islands as aggressive as well. I would also, and by aggression, I think here we also need to say a clear move to change the territorial status quo, as well as the conduct and rules by which maritime actors have acted for hundreds of years. And I think on Japan, China's acted quite aggressively as well. Of course, there's always two sides to a dispute, but in terms of the ramping up of the uses of military and maritime non-military power in the East China Sea to undermine what the U.S. and much of the civilized world recognizes as Japanese administrative control over the Senkaku Daitai island chain as aggressive on a daily basis. The amount of ships that are put to sea, number in the thousands sometimes, depending on the week, that China uses to make claims there. I think the military modernization program that China has undergone since the end of the Cold War, which is highly focused on being able to attack and neutralize U.S. Soldiers and systems that are forward deployed in Japan, mostly in Japan, but in South Korea as well. But the Western Pacific has aggressive intent. Now, I should say here that obviously, if I was Chinese and a defense planner, I would look out over the horizon on my one coast and see Japan and see the United States operating there and think they're the aggressor and they have no business being there. But as an American, I would, and American and the alliances that the United States protects, I would say, well, the U.S. has been there for reasons since 1945, and the reasons actually have benefited most of the region, including China itself, creating peaceful conditions for countries to grow economically and so forth. I would say China is now, I wouldn't use the word aggressive necessarily in the world order, but certainly in the 19th Party Congress report for 2017, it's no longer kind of a secret, or there's no mystique to what China wants to do. They've laid it all out in 2017. And that includes changing fundamentally the world order to be more aligned with the Chinese Communist Party's preferences. They call that international institutions a community for common destiny for all of mankind, saying that China's vision of how the world should operate will be much less hegemonic and warlike than the United States' vision for world order, also propagating what the Chinese call socialist values and so forth throughout the world. I don't know if we can define that as aggressive. I think that's what great powers do when they rise. And certainly the internal dynamics of China, the need for the Chinese Communist Party that doesn't enjoy democratic legitimacy and increasingly doesn't enjoy the same levels of economic growth and performance that it did for so many years. This for the Chinese Communist Party is a matter of survival. So to reshape the world order in a less sort of liberal fashion, less democratic fashion, is a matter of survival for China. But even though I would say I'm sympathetic, but I understand the reasons why China is moving out in this very assertive fashion and reshaping basic institutions and rules of the world order. Even though I understand why they're doing it, it makes it no less concerning, not just for the United States, but particularly for many of the smaller powers throughout the Indo-Pacific region and other places that stand to lose a lot from this type of coercion and interference as well. China's other tools of coercion and influence have been uncovered and discovered in places like Australia and New Zealand, where there were all sorts of attempts to buy out politicians that to more align with China's ways of doing things. So I think that I would define aggression as forced, non-negotiated changes in the status quo, forced, non-negotiated changes in the military balance of power in ways that are directed at you can build a military, for example, to provide for the public good, to be able to police the sea lanes, to be able to police to join in campaigns that keep energy supply open. But that's not what China chose to do. China chose to take what the U.S. weaknesses are in terms of its global military power and build systems to undermine it. So, and then I think you also asked us
Perhaps you can
wrap up. Yes, I can go on and on and on.
You can find this
Yeah, I'll just wrap up by saying that I'm certainly not surprised by any of this. If you were watching China 20 years ago, you could see that though it was focused more than on economic reform and development, there was a general unhappiness, not just unhappiness, but kind of fear of the international system in the 1990s. Fear that because so many communist countries and dictatorships were falling throughout from 1989 through 2000 and so forth, you could see China beginning to build out its power and influence in ways that would push back the United States and Western influence.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. So I think that we'll have a good discussion because my view of aggression is that it has a very specific meaning, and we are not doing any benefit by not using it precisely. Aggression has a very precise meaning, and frankly, the way this whole meeting was framed, it's a little like the old leading lawyer's question: have you stopped beating your spouse? If you agree with the premise, then somehow you've accepted. If you answer the question, you've accepted the premise. I don't accept the premise. Aggression has a very specific meaning under international law, going back at least to the Nuremberg tribunals. It has a larger meaning in English, but it seems to me it's good that we should use it precisely, and that meaning is defined under the United Nations international law as the use of armed force by a state against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence of another state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the Charter. So use of armed force is critical to that definition. Russia in 2014 was an aggressor when it invaded Ukraine and seized the Crimea. Nothing, I would argue, that China has done up to this point could be regarded as an aggression under international law. It has done things coercively. It has done things that have violated international law. But under the strict definition of aggression, it is not an aggressor. Now, there's a broader definition, which Mr. Blumenthal has deployed. But I think before we start labeling states as aggressors, which has a very explosive and has lots of ramifications in using it, we should be very, very careful about the use of the term. I would argue that China is a rival, it is a competitor, sometimes it's a collaborator. It is many different things. It is very problematic in many ways in terms of what its policies have been in recent years. And I think constructing a strategy to counter China when it is behaving in ways that run counter to our interests or our allies' interests is not going to be helped by calling China an aggressor. Now, what do we need to understand? Mr. Blumenthal has already indicated some of the things. First of all, clearly China is an authoritarian state ruled by a Leninist party that has one dominant goal, which is maintaining itself in power in China. And they're very clear about this. Repeatedly, that has been clear. The Chinese Communist Party wants to stay in power. That has had two strategies attached to it, which don't always run together. One is economic prosperity and growth, which points toward social stability and a certain conservatism in the Chinese elite, I would argue. And then, on the other hand, nationalism, which has become very apparent, particularly since the Tiananmen incident in 1989, and particularly prominent under Xi Jinping. I'll come back to that in a moment. But as I say, they go together uneasily. Nationalism suggests a degree of disruption, of discontent, and sometimes coercive behavior toward other states. But if you want to keep your economy humming along, you really don't want to engage in too many provocative sorts of measures because they can be destabilizing. And I would argue that explains a lot about Chinese behavior. For example, its relatively reticent view of what's been going on in Hong Kong, when I frankly expected there to be a much more coercive response. So it's also important to remember that we're talking about nearly 1/5 of the world's population, and an economy that will be, is by some measures the largest economy in the world, will be the largest economy in the world almost inevitably within the next decade, however you measure it. And those are facts that are not going to go away. Ostracizing or labeling a country like that of that importance as an aggressor, once again, I would argue, does not help our cause in constructing a strategy to deal with it. It's also important to note that unlike most aggressor states in the past, such as Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, China has integrated very deeply with the world economy. That is not a typical strategy for a state that is pursuing an aggressive stance. It's become a major exporter. It's a major trading partner with many of its neighbors, which explains their behavior as well. It's a recipient of large-scale foreign investment and increasingly important outward investor as well, including investments in the United States but other countries. It has been very successful at lifting a large share of its population out of extreme poverty. In fact, it's been so successful they've actually affected the global statistics on extreme poverty. And China has joined many, many regional institutions and global institutions since 1980. It has been a major joiner of all kinds of multilateral organizations and institutions regionally. It has created some, which are clearly directed to pursuing its own national interests, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. But once again, this doesn't typically align with what you would expect from a state that has large-scale aggressive intentions going forward. Because joining institutions of this kind may not be very constraining, but they are constraining to a degree, even on China and even on large states like China or the United States. So what has happened? Why have things gone downhill so fast? You will recall in the first year of the Trump administration, President Trump and Xi Jinping were great buddies. They were tremendous friends. Maybe they still are, I don't know. It's hard to say what's going on from day to day. But something clearly happened with the ascendancy of Xi Jinping, and I think most of my friends who are true sinologists, as I am not, would argue that his rise to power has marked an inflection point, which has made China even more problematic than it was previously. I agree with Mr. Blumenthal that there always were problems going back some distance, but Xi Jinping is a particular problem. Why? First of all, he has constructed this idea of the China dream, identifying the Chinese Communist Party with a nationalist kind of renovation and emphasizing the nationalist side of the support structure of the Chinese Communist Party. He has, as Mr. Blumenthal has suggested, expanded Chinese Communist Party control over universities, the media, the internet, private enterprises. China is a much more repressive society today than it was 5 years ago. There seems to be no question about that. And the repression has particularly fallen hard on national minorities like the Uyghurs, where we have seen levels of repression against national minorities that I think you would have to go back to the Maoist era to see anything comparable. He has campaigned against foreign liberal influences of all kinds, including the United States, but also European countries. He's campaigned against international NGOs and heightened surveillance and repression against their activists in China. And economically, although there were many who expected Xi Jinping to come to power and continue market reforms, whatever he did on the political side, in fact, there's been a great deal of backsliding on that front as well. State-owned enterprises now play a larger role in the Chinese economy. The private sector has taken a smaller role and has become much more increasingly linked to the Chinese Communist Party. China has engaged in economic practices that clearly run counter to the interests of the United States and other market economies, such as subsidies for the state-owned enterprises, restrictions on certain investment in certain sectors of its economy, technology transfers that have been forced, joint venture requirements, a whole host of things that we could ignore when China was small, but now that China is large, it's very, very difficult to ignore them. Now, I would point out most of these practices are not unique to China by any means. But the fact that China is so large makes them particularly damaging to the interests of other countries. And here, once again, not only the United States, but other industrialized economies in Europe and in Japan as well. At the same time, China has continued to engage in multilateral cooperative efforts. It is a signatory to the Paris Accords on climate change. How much it's going to implement those accords remains to be seen, but it is the United States that has pulled out of the Paris Accords, not China. It still remains part of the JCPOA on the Iranian nuclear program. It is the United States that has pulled out of that accord, not China. And I would have to say the one thing that has puzzled me, despite the assertiveness of Xi Jinping, is that he has not taken a particularly hard line against Taiwan, as you might have expected. He has, certainly since the DPP, a party which the Chinese governments of all kinds view as advocating independence for Taiwan. Since that party has taken power, has engaged in economic and other types of coercive measures. But there is no real sense that Xi Jinping is aiming to use force to unify Taiwan with China. And let's recall once again that American governments, going back to Richard Nixon, have admitted that Taiwan is part of China. And so, for that matter, despite its special status, is Hong Kong. Finally, on the question of the South China Sea and military modernization, South China Sea is the area where one can certainly say China has taken steps where it has broken promises, the promise it made not to militarize the Spratly Islands and other parts of the South China Sea. It has been found in violation of international law in terms of its vast claims in the South China Sea. The 9-dash line was found in 2016 by an international tribunal to be basically having no basis in international law as we understand it. I would also, as an aside, however, point out that Taiwan also recognizes the 9-dash line and those claims in the South China Sea as the Republic of China. So those claims have been part of Chinese claims, national claims, since I believe the 1930s. You can correct me, but I believe those who look back in the archives, the first 9-dash line mentioned was in the 1930s when Blumenthal ruled China, not the Chinese Communist Party. So I think the question is, how do you deal with a complicated, large, assertive, problematic country like China? And maybe we can, without taking more time now, we can talk about that more in question and answer, because I do think there are certainly things we could do. The main rule I would lay out at the outset is we must do them with other countries, whatever we decide to do, which we have not been doing recently. We are not going to have China change if it's the United States against China. We will have China possibly change if we are aligned with our other allies in the industrialized world in particular, and the other liberal democracies.
So before we do the Q&A, I'd like perhaps you might take some minutes to counter or just need to
Sure,
respond
yeah,
to
thank you very much. Well, first on Taiwan, we consider correct. The United States has never, ever recognized Taiwan. It's very carefully in the communiques acknowledged China's position and left room for the two sides to negotiate based on mutual consent. It is never recognized the one China principle. It's very careful to say we have a one China policy based on the 72 communiques, all of which acknowledge but not accept China's position. Very careful. Second on Taiwan, all you have to do is Google China military coordinating on Taiwan and see the extent of the military power used every single day against Taiwan. Now, it used to be that China, see, one of the constructs here, one of the problems here is that isn't it nice for China that Americans sometimes tend to so narrowly focus on little pieces of international law? It's precisely because of that point that China's grand strategy is to use other kinds of military force to go beyond the threshold of very narrowly legalistically defined aggression. So if you're sitting there in Taiwan, and every single day you see Chinese bombers overfly the airspace, Chinese ships come through all the different passageways in the Ryukyu Islands up through Japan, down through the Bashi Channel in the Philippines, onto Taiwan, circumvent it, and then make blood-curdling speeches about how we will never allow Taiwan to separate from the mainland. And we're talking about a democratically elected government that has never, ever advocated for independence. In fact, it has reached out to China. And the first female elected president in the Chinese culture, in fact, has reached out to China at every term and been rejected. So if we're going to, China wins, this is the same thing that China did with the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement. China wins when the United States, which it does often, has these extremely narrowly focused definitions of aggression. Because it says, but we're not being aggressive. And we're using our Coast Guard to cut off Vietnamese fishing vessels. If you're a Vietnamese or Filipino fisherman, you think you care whether the Chinese are actually, the PLA Navy is actually firing anti-cruise missiles at you, or whether the Coast Guard has trained its missiles on you? No, of course not. It has the same effect. So that's just a trap. That falls into China's trap. The same thing they did with the International Nuclear Forces Agreement, which thankfully we pulled out of, which is, what they did was essentially they said, isn't this great? The US and Russia are locked into an agreement that eliminates entire classes of weaponry. Guess what? The Chinese built the most active missile program in the world because the US and Russia were locked out of that. And so if we really kind of stick to these narrow definitions, the Russians do the same thing. The Chinese will figure out, as they have, how to use quote-unquote non-military, what they call non-contact, maritime fishing vessels. We have 2,000 of them. 2,000. It's larger than most navies. To every day use force and aggression. And force can be employed and the shooting. Force can be employed to intimidate, change the status quo. If that's not aggression, I don't know what is.
Well, I just told you what aggression is, and it's not that. That is what great powers do. And yes, they are objectionable, and we may want to counter them, but it does not behoove us to use aggression in this way when we have states like Russia, which are truly aggressive. I mean, they are using aggression to seize the territory of other states. The claims in the South China Sea, as Professor Heng-Blackburn also attested, she's a specialist on Southeast Asia, are conflicting claims by many states. One of the largest island in the Spratly Islands is occupied by Taiwan. Vietnam has claims in the South China Sea. I believe the other states probably have claims that are justified under international law, the way the China's are not. But there are conflicting claims there. China has become particularly assertive and willing to use coercive force in defending its claims in the last decade to 5 years, but those claims have been there for a very long time. And they're likely to persist. Why China doesn't, you can answer better than I perhaps, why China has chosen to stake out its claims in this way. It doesn't impress me it's gaining them anything internationally or regionally. It's not allowing the exploitation of the resources in the South China Sea. But to take that one domain of Chinese activity and thereby portray an entire country or an entire government as an aggressor, it seems to me, is extreme and an overstatement and very unhelpful in constructing a positive strategy toward China, which will admit that it is our competitor, our rival, but also in some cases our collaborator. We will not accomplish what we need to accomplish on climate change if China is not on board. And that's a simple fact. And China is, at the moment, on board, at least on paper. Whether it will do anything about its commitments is a good question. We'll have a review of the Paris Agreement coming up. But as I said, the country that's pulled out of the Paris Agreement is the United States. And it was indeed a bilateral agreement between Xi Jinping and President Obama, which laid the groundworks for the Paris Agreement and for some movement forward on climate change after many years in which China refused to do very much at all. So once again, yes, in certain sectors, in certain domains, including the economy, which we haven't talked about very much, China is pursuing policies which run counter to American interests. It has pursued policies in other domains which intersect more positively with our interests. I would just mention one other area we haven't talked about. We're very unlikely to achieve what we want to achieve with North Korea, although what that is these days, once again, on the US side is a little hard to discern, without Chinese collaboration. And at least initially during the Trump administration, China did collaborate with the United States in imposing much tougher sanctions on North Korea on its nuclear program. Once again, nothing is going to happen vis-a-vis North Korea if China is not in some way on board. They are the major economic partner of North Korea. And unless they collaborate on those, on that very important issue, nothing is going to happen. And this is precisely why I would argue previous administrations have always gone soft with China on the economic side because we needed Chinese collaboration on these other issues. This administration, not so much. But in past administrations, that was the balancing act that had to be pursued.
I think Mr. Blumenthal to respond. We have a bit of time. And can I just maybe raise this, now under the present administration moved on to a new strategy for countering China, the free open Indo-Pacific strategy. So we move away from Obama's rebalance, to the free open Indo-Pacific, and as a new emphasis, new direction on how to counter the perceived Chinese aggression. So if you could both talk about, the free open Pacific strategy and where do you see the strengths and where do you see the shortfalls, in that strategy and
Yeah, absolutely. Just factually, China's never cooperated. I mean, when I was working at the Pentagon in 2001, I used to hear this all the time. And I used to hear it from senior policymakers trying to convince China of its own national interests. It knows its national interests very well, which is to maintain a buffer state, to have the United States jerk its chain, and this has been going on since the Korean War. China breaks sanctions almost on a daily basis, and has been breaking them as soon as they sign them. They have never, ever, despite the fact that the Bush administration and the Obama administration were soft on China in the latter part of the years, China has never lived up to its commitments in terms of the United Nations security resolutions. It's just if you go up to the North Korean border with China, it's just a complete market exchange between the North Koreans and the Chinese. So we've tried all of this. I think in 1991, you could make an argument, 92, that you can co-opt China. It's a fairly arrogant American argument. You can co-opt China through all these incentives, and they'll become more like us, and they'll align. It just didn't work. They didn't help us on North Korea. They break the Iran sanctions all the time. They sign all kinds of agreements. They are the number one climate change signing or not climate change signing. Besides the fact that the Obama administration had to be much more weak with China in the South China Sea and not answer it after it started to break its promise to militarize the South China Sea because of wanting China's cooperation in the Paris climate exchange. Guess what the Chinese were doing on the environment and energy? Buying more coal and gas and oil from the United States. China has the number one most degraded water and air in the world. I'm not talking about sort of rich country climate problems. I'm talking about people's access to air and like that. They can do something about the environment. Also in the South China Sea, the amount of environmental degradation and devastation the Chinese have created with this dredging. Leave the maritime claims aside for a second. Just the creation of new islands, the amount of destruction the Chinese have created there is unprecedented. So the idea that China would ever be a real partner in climate change is just, you have to sort of suspend this week. I'm countering real quick. So the Obama, Bush, and Trump administration more or less, when it comes to regional strategy, followed the same strategy, build up India, build up with the Japan relationship. Obama administration started to build capacity more in the Philippines. The Trump administration has accelerated that process. So neither side would like to admit it, but very common. The Trump administration has been more aggressive in challenging China's claims. It has a closer relationship with Taiwan and Japan. But basically the same except on the economic issues where the Trump administration has taken a much more aggressive stance.
Any thoughts on the free open Indo-Pacific strategies?
Well, I think the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy is simply a way to bring India into the equation. And that's probably a good idea, certainly, if India is willing to do that. But it doesn't impress me that India is very interested in being pulled into anything like a quasi-alliance with the United States. They have always pursued a very, very unique national policy, pursuing their own interests, obviously. They have been very skeptical of anything that smacks of an alliance. They recently forged some new agreements with Russia, which certainly doesn't run in alignment with U.S. interests in this regard. So India is going to pursue its own set of policies, and obviously has its own concerns right now with Pakistan, a major ally, if you will, or certainly a friend of China. China only has one formal ally, North Korea. So I think it has been an aspiration of many American administrations to pull India as another democracy, as a country that's concerned about China, that has territorial disputes with China, into something like a larger framework. And that may well be the case, but I don't think India wants to be pulled into anything that looks like an alliance or even a coalition that's directly against China. It's certainly collaborating more with Australia, Japan, and other countries in the Pacific region, but I don't see that as becoming some new concept. Let's be clear, the one thing that we could have done to counter China economically in terms of constructing different rules and placing China at a very big economic disadvantage was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which this administration pulled out of in its first week of office. So, you can't counter China, which is an economic behemoth in the Pacific region, if you're not willing to play on that field. And right now, we're not. I think it's fairly clear. You can conduct a unilateral trade war with China, but if you're also conducting a trade war with your own allies in other areas, and pulling out of the one agreement which put China at a disadvantage economically, that's not a clear strategy on the economic front. And economics and politics and the military dimension are all intertwined here. They cannot be separated.
Excellent. That leaves us about more than 20 minutes for Q&A, which is great. So I'll take 2 questions at a time. And if you could identify yourself, if you ask a question, okay. Let me just put the guy in the red t-shirt and then the guy behind. Identify yourself and then your question.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Jordan Davidson, and I was just curious. I know you guys didn't really touch on it that much, but moving more into like the economics of China with the Belt and Road Initiative, I was curious. I'm using the kind of. I know you guys had 2 different definitions of aggression, but going toward, for now at least, Mr. Blumenthal's definition of aggression, would you classify China's Belt and Road like almost neo-colonialist, like debt trap diplomacy as like strategy as aggressive? And is that, and secondly, is that as dangerous, if not more, or less dangerous than what they're doing more, I guess, regionally in terms of their relations with Taiwan and what they're doing with their basically ships, cutting off trade routes and fishermen and stuff like that?
Thank you. So yeah, with the white shirt. Identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Chris O'Sullivan. I came in late, so if you already discussed it, please forgive me. My question is, you discussed China's maritime claims in the South China Sea in the context of it being a historical dispute going on since the 1930s. But it recently escalated, especially in context of its Senkaku Island dispute with Japan. So I guess my question is, when you consider it, when you see it in this context, is it fair to call it aggression, and also kind of a side question to that? If this has been a long-standing historical dispute, why has it escalated now?
Mr. Blumenthal, can you take this first?
So,
Two.
the two questions, absolutely. So, first, it's not been a long-standing historical dispute. The ROC in the 1930s, without having full control over China, quickly drew up a map because they were asked to by the United States as a burgeoning ally as the Japanese were invading. And they quickly drew up a map, even though they hadn't been a maritime power since Zheng He, the Ming Dynasty. And they somehow still mysteriously, a photographer came up with those lines. But actually, if you go back to who had the greatest claim back then to the paracels of this battle, would be the French, the Vietnam. So the one sort of simple answer to your question is China's pushed on these claims. And again, let's be clear, it's not just pushing on these claims and calling this South China Sea Chinese territory and administering them. It's also all this dredging and creating new islands and so forth. It's because China has more power, and they thought they had a moment where the United States was weak. Senkaku Daigatai, it's aggression. I mean, they're using the Coast Guard and the maritime militia to ram fishing boats, and then they're putting the PLA behind them in case the Japanese escalate. And they're trying to have a clear goal, which is to change the status quo administration. One Belt, One Road. So I'm sorry I'm talking so much. They let me out of the house. I'm finishing up a book manuscript called Nightmare China, Grand Aspirations, Decaying State. And so China's actually stagnating economically. And it started to do so probably around 2008, 2009. And it hasn't been well seen by most people. But that was during the financial crisis where the European and the American markets dried up. The Chinese enacted the biggest fiscal stimulus program known to mankind, which racked up so much debt in such a short period that it started to weigh on the economy. You combine that with misuse of capital land and no real moves to intellectual property, you see why China, 2016, its growth might have been zero. Now, people are playing around with what its growth actually is, but it's big and it's powerful, but it's not close to the United States. And probably shrinking in that regard. Also, the demographic problems are beyond imagination. It's becoming as old as Europe without getting rich. One Belt, One Road is problematic. So if you're sitting here in the United States, you can say, you know what, fine, they're wasting their money. I mean, who cares, right? They're forcing SOEs to go do unprofitable construction projects in places that we would never touch, and spend down their foreign currency reserves to do so. But if you're sitting in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Kenya, then you're more concerned because there's a lot of pure bribery, a lot of elite bribery. The construction projects, if you look at the numbers very closely, you see that most of the One Belt, One Road construction projects are in the transport and energy sector. So there's a plan to construct an alternative supply route, an alternative energy sector going from Africa to the Indian Ocean back through Pakistan and so forth. If you're India, you're more concerned. I agree completely that India is not going to be an ally of the United States. If we just allow India to develop, it has its own concerns with China that oftentimes will go on.
Sure. So you kind of conflated South China Sea, East China Sea. But I guess the question in my mind, which I don't think anyone has a good answer for, is why anyone is interested, and to the degree that China has become interested in these islands, especially the East China Sea. I think, generally speaking, from what I've read, there's not a lot of value in the East China Sea. There's some natural gas, hydrocarbon resources, but it's become a symbolic issue between China and Japan. And I think a lot of what is happening in the South China Sea is that, I think mistakenly, the Chinese leadership has nailed its nationalist flag to maintaining its 9-dash line in the South China Sea, which is untenable in terms of international law, in terms of its neighbors' interests, untenable probably in terms of any real environmentally sustainable development of the South China Sea. And it's going to be very difficult for them to climb down from that, even if they wish to. It's not clear that they wish to at this point. But I think you have to understand sometimes territory becomes an issue between states when it doesn't have any intrinsic value whatsoever. It just becomes a symbolic issue. And I think South China Sea, you can make the argument there are real resources there that could be exploited. In East China Sea, that's hard to state, I think, or hard to discern. In the case of the Belt and Road Initiative, it's not clear what China is trying to do. There are many things that it's pursuing many interests there. First of all, it's exporting essentially industries that are in decline in China as its construction boom winds down. So cement, steel, all these over-invested industries can now export infrastructure essentially to the rest of the world. That's part of it. Part of it is clearly an influence strategy of various kinds, tying countries to China through infrastructure networks. And clearly, they are most comfortable in dealing with countries that are, as Mr. Blumenthal suggested, relatively non-transparent, relatively corrupt, willing to do deals with China which the local elites can skim off their share. This happened in Malaysia, it happened in Sri Lanka, in the Maldives. I'm a little less concerned about it because in all of these cases, those corrupt elites ultimately were thrown out of office. And China made no effort to intervene, to prop them up. And frankly, it's dealing with the successor governments in much the same way, or trying to at least, So the idea that China always gets it right, or that China can always call it right, is simply false. I mean, I think China often gets it wrong, and that countries that are concerned about their own autonomy are going to be very concerned and nervous about the Belt and Road, as they already have become. The one thing we can do, certainly, that would be most useful is to make sure they have options to Belt and Road. The reason they turn to China is because China offers, once again, with a lot of debt, they offer cheap infrastructure of the kind that countries need, and that the multilateral banks like the World Bank and even the ADB have not provided to the degree that these countries would like. So if we don't provide them with an option, they're going to turn to China. That gets back to the question about TPP. If we don't provide them with an economic option, they're going to turn to China. And that's what we need. That's certainly one of the things we need to do.
I would just quickly mention that none of the countries you mentioned were in the TPP.
We're talking about the Belt and Road.
Oh, in terms of the alternative.
No, they're two separate things. Do TPP and the Belt and Road. I'm just saying the governments in Belt and Road, if we offer them infrastructure funding, not through TPP, but through multilateral development banks, to the degree that they would like, we might have a better chance in dealing with Belt and Road. One of the reasons the Belt and Road has been successful to the degree that it has, it seems to me, is there has been a long-standing critique of the multilateral development banks. They have done many good things, governance, social programs and the like, but they have not downgraded, but they diminished relatively their support for infrastructure lending, which is what things like the World Bank, institutions like the World Bank, used to really do. That was all they did. They now do many different things, but there is a big infrastructure deficit, especially in Asia, and China's stepping in its own way, and without some alternative that looks as attractive as Chinese lending, that's probably what we do.
Next two questions, first, okay, front and then next, I'll take from here. So you,
Thank you for your words. I would like to ask you something.
yourself, please.
Oh, sorry. My name is Eduardo Castellet. I'm a freshman here, and I have recently been following the moves of the European Union and Japan in Southeast Asia. I have seen that recently the European Union signed a free trade agreement with Vietnam and with Japan independently. And I wanted to ask both of you, how do you think that is going to shape Southeast Asia? Is it going to make those countries more safe, more safe from Chinese coercion or aggression, or do you think it's going to go sideways?
Good, thank you. The next question. Sorry, you had the structure too.
I'm Mobian, a sophomore at SIS. To the speaker on the left, I was wondering if you think it's possible that the definition of aggression that you were using is too constraining, because it implies that aggression can only be directed towards another nation as opposed to their own people. Because it would seem that as opposed to the United States, China has been pursuing policies that has been pursuing unilateral policies that are aggressive, up to and including lethal force, to ensure that they retain security over their minority groups and regions like Hong Kong and Taiwan, which perhaps would identify themselves as independent.
The speaker to the left.
Okay.
Bigger left from me.
Oh,
Your left.
Oh, again, when you about the EU, that sort of demonstrates my earlier point that by providing options to countries, you're necessarily going to reduce the leverage that China has over them. I mean, China probably would like to have a closed regional sphere of some kind in East Asia and Southeast Asia, but in fact, if you look at the actual pattern of trade and trade agreements, there are many cross-cutting trade agreements, and the EU one with Japan, the EU and Vietnam. It's called sometimes the noodle bowl because there are so many of them and they cut across one another. And clearly that makes it very difficult to conceive of the idea that China is going to have constructed in like a 1930s sense, a closed economic sphere in Southeast Asia. These are not tiny, well, some of them are tiny. Most of them are pretty vibrant, medium-sized economies. And they're quite strategic in their own right in terms of constructing partnerships with different states, as they have with the EU. And the EU has been pretty aggressive about moving in this front with Japan and others as well. Once again, unlike the United States in the last few years. Regarding aggression, it's fun. You can define aggression any way you like. I think, however, everything we don't like becomes aggression. Then the term loses all meaning. There are various ways to describe what China does. Coercion, which we've used. Against its own population, quite clearly the violations of human rights are massive in places like Xinjiang province, no question about it. But to call that aggression, I don't see the value of adding to repression or violations of human rights the term aggression, which has an accepted meaning that I think should be continued, the way it has been. Because I do think it does make a difference. I think Russia is an aggressive country in a way that China has not been up to this point. And it has suffered international multilateral sanctions as a result of that, the kind that China has not. Now, if China continues down the road it's going, it's quite possible that we would be confronted with a situation, for example, in Hong Kong, where we would have to confront Chinese steps the way we have confronted Russia. But once again, there would be ambiguity there, because there was an agreement that Hong Kong will revert to China in the future, that its special status does have a time limit. And that makes it different than the Crimea, for example, in the case of Russia's invasion in 2014.
On Hong Kong, actually, the reversion happened in '97, and then the
Special status.
Well, the treaty that was signed.
Yes, I understand.
Yeah.
The special status will end. That's what I'm saying.
Actually, no. The dispute right now is that as a condition of the reversion and the special status, the Chinese were supposed to move to allowing Hong Kongers universal suffrage.
Yes.
So we kept our end of the bargain, and the Chinese didn't. So I agree on the TPP. I mean, as a lukewarm supporter of it, I couldn't believe that everyone from Secretary Clinton to Donald Trump to had been people who had supported it came out against it. It's a tragedy. We're in a tough time in trade politics in the United States. So it's not like in 2020, if Donald Trump lost, we'd have the TPP. And no one's calling for it. None of his political opponents are, in fact, very much like his trade policies. Most popular thing he's doing. So we're in a tough time for free trade. Unfortunately, because it's Kahler said, it's a key issue. So the European Union can provide some. So Vietnam, a country like Vietnam, if we're very strategic, which countries are the prizes? Which countries do we really want on our side? Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines. Those are big, demographically very solid, growing aspirational countries. Vietnam wants one thing, it wants market access in the United States. The market is so big. The U.S. consumer is the most powerful force in international economics. And so I'd absolutely be for some kind of gold standard free trade agreement. I just think that, and Prime Minister Abe, to his credit, is trying to keep the TPP multilateral negotiations alive. U.S. politics is just in a state that has to work itself through the next 10 years. I think
connecting the next two questions from this? Gosh, all right. Or you and we'll go with the two more. The first two, and then the one in the back, and then one way back. So we'll do the next one, two, and then two.
Hi, I'm Gabriel, and I would like to ask this question to both speakers. So, in terms of geopolitics, how effective do you think the Quad can be? Because we were by Shinzabe would be kind of military defense agreement between the US, Australia, Japan, and India.
Yeah, another one.
Hello, my name is Ben Stahl. I'm a SIS freshman, actually also studying Chinese politics. My question is it's a bit of a different trend. This is specific to, I guess, the ongoing trade war right now that obviously over the past couple of years with the Bush administration, the Obama administration, US and Chinese economies have become very integrated. And right now with the current trade war, we see in certain industries we never really would have thought decreases in trade, say service industry with tourism, and education at higher education institutions, infrastructure, etc. So should we as American consumers, I guess, be concerned about the ongoing escalations that could be occurring? And I guess where's the turning point in which we as Americans should start saying no more to this continuing, I guess, escalation that is occurring?
So I agree on India, and I think it would be hoping for too much to think there's going to be a quasi-alliance. U.S., Australia, and Japan are allies, and they're treaty allies. They cooperate very well. This has actually been a good continued bipartisan continuation of the U.S. foreign policy since probably the late 90s, moving to more and more cooperation. The Indians, as the professor said, are extremely sort of prickly about any alliances, and they're not aligned. I mean, just like Indonesia, they're a non-aligned country. I think it's fine for us to have a relationship with India that's not an alliance, that's just another power center, so that China doesn't become hegemonic in Asia. The same with Indonesia. I think that we will meet with the Quad, and we have certain common maritime interests. South China Sea is important for a lot of the reasons that the professor said. It's also geostrategically important, both from a Chinese perspective. It's where most of their oil and energy comes through, and they want to control it. From the rest of the world's perspective, it's where so much commercial traffic comes through, and India has an interest in seeing that happen from the Chinese leaders.
So we finally got to trade. I didn't think we were ever going to get to trade. So there are lots of things going on in trade. And really, we're beginning to see kind of bifurcation between those who, including, I think, our current trade representative, Mr. Lighthizer, saw this as a kind of Japan, version 2 from the 1980s when he was the last very prominent trade policy, which is, China has been, there are a number of practices that China has, that I mentioned in my discussion, that China has been pursuing, and they have to stop. And we should take the measures that we've taken. I'm not sure he was that enthusiastic about the tariffs, but he went along with them. But the point is, we're trying to get China to stop specific practices which their state-directed economy, which has become more state-directed under Xi Jinping, has been pursuing. And we talked about subsidies, so on, forced transfer of technology and the like. Now there is a view, however, that we need to decouple from China. So this has always been the view of Peter Navarro, who is at Trump's side when he thinks about Chinese trade, apparently. I moved here from California. Peter Navarro was a failed politician in California before he became a White House force. But anyway, Peter Navarro, and others now increasingly are arguing we should decouple from the Chinese economy. We are too interdependent on China, and that the trade war really is about that. I honestly don't know which, it's very hard to see in the president's mind what he is aiming for, whether he's aiming for one or the other, because it seems to change a lot from day to day. And I think, personally, that the decoupling, which probably is merited in certain areas for strategic reasons, really needs to be done with a scalpel. And I think now people are starting to think about decoupling as doing a sledgehammer. And I think that would be a big mistake. Because I think China, we are much more dependent on China, just as China is dependent on us. The interdependence is very, very close, especially in manufacturing. We have not had a lot of pushback except from farmers, and the farmers are being fed subsidies by the administration, so they don't make too much trouble. But now the manufacturing sector is starting to feel it because a lot of the whole point about globalization is the inputs are coming from China, and they're being used by American manufacturers to produce products that are sold all around the world. Now they are having to find new sources, which is very difficult because South China is the manufacturing hub in many ways of the world. Now, like I said, there are reasons you may want to disengage certain sectors. I agree with Mr. Blumenthal, we should not be contributing technology to Chinese repression internally, and that should be scrutinized extremely carefully. There are certain types of interdependence that are directly related to our defense capabilities, which probably should be scrutinized very carefully. But the idea that we should do some global decoupling, I think, A, is going to be very difficult, and B, very painful politically, and ultimately economically very damaging to both sides, but to the United States as well as China. So, I mean, we're seeing this in Brexit, right? This is like Brexit too. Breaking up is hard to do, and the British economy is not doing well just talking about Brexit. And so the interdependence with China and the United States is not quite the level of Britain and Europe, but it's very close interdependence. And I think the other thing, politically, we will see after the Christmas season when the new tariffs kick in, there's going to be a lot more pain. American consumers are going to feel it because up to this point, most of the tariffs have fallen on intermediate goods. They have not fallen on consumer goods. Now they're going to fall on your iPhones and your electronics and things of that kind, and your insurance. So it'll be much more complicated, I think, going into the new year unless some settlement. I don't see any settlement. Mr. Blumenthal, I don't think it's going to happen.
So if you could, we have we're right out of time, but keep the questions short. The two gentlemen was over there, and then gentleman there. And I'd like to have one of you answer the questions, one of the female students. Oh, okay. Right. Great. We need a female voice. All right. Okay, so let's start with you. And the last question. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jake Rodriguez. I'm a junior in the School of International Service. So my question has to do with intellectual property and also intelligence. In that, I'm sure you guys are familiar with Confucian Institutes and how CCP sort of fight its way to college campuses. But there are many other ways in which we do business and science in Chinese. For example, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare shares a lot of health data with Chinese that has been used in a lot of the security apparatus that they're building in Xinjiang. But my question is, what are your thoughts on the idea of some sort of ban or some sort of severe restriction on Chinese students, academics, people who are allowed to travel into the United States? Because, as far as from my view of the situation, even if you do not want this life for the Chinese government, if you were a Chinese citizen and your family lives in mainland China, you do not have a choice unless you want to become a CIA asset. And I don't think that's sort of the opposite of what most of these people want. So how do we deal with the fact that they are doing these sort of coercive things to their own people, and it is also costing us in many ways? I know that's not a quick question, but
right. Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you both. Thank you all of you for speaking to us. My question for you is, when the convergence theory, end of history theory came about in the early aughts, there were examples given to bolster it, like South Korea. Why are we discovering now that that theory is not applicable to China? What is it about the Chinese case that really throws a wrench into the convergence theory?
Okay, final question.
I'm actually going to stand because I'm behind all these tall men. Thank you both for coming here today. What an interesting debate. I have a question kind of similar to the previous one that was asked, but more concerned on cybersecurity and how China's been linked to a lot of attacks on American intellectual property and American private companies as well. How do you think that factors into countering their aggression in the age of digital media, the internet, data, and how can we still maintain a good relationship
Sure. So, generally speaking, I'm against blanket bans on any ethnic or religious group. It is a tragedy, as you say, that actually in the 19th Party Congress report, the Chinese Communist Party came out and said we're going to use overseas Chinese to further our national interest in the United Front campaigns. And that's a tragedy for Western liberal democracies because, as you said, they're coercing people into suspicious activities, and that's against our core values. But we do have to scrutinize because of the levels of intellectual property theft and the kinds of things that we just, not so much a sleep at the switch, deliberately through our engagement strategy. Now we have very deep embedded AI joint development centers, MIT and Tsinghua, and things that as Kahler said, we have to scrutinize more because those would diffuse into repressive activities, and those could diffuse into repressive activities in China or into military modernization. So we do, and we are actually scrutinizing more carefully some of these scientific exchanges. Convergence theory and history actually was 1991 or something. I don't know. But very quick answer, it's a very good question on South Korea. So I would submit to you that we followed, at the time, a very rational China engagement policy based on the success we had with South Korea, Taiwan, and Philippines and Japan. So we actually, on a bipartisan basis, integrated them into the U.S.-led international order and pushed for democratization in each one of those countries and got it. But the big difference is that they were allies by a security level. We didn't do it in a coercive manner. We put political pressure on them and used our alliance relationship to leverage them into conversion, more or less. We thought the same could happen with China. The difference is China is not an ally. China's scale is so much bigger. China, has a long history of its own in terms of its geopolitical centrality in the region and elsewhere. On and on and on. They go. It's not South Korea. Finally, okay. So let me answer really quickly. Let me just bring 5G into this. So there's two big concerns. One is obviously what the U.S. military and Department of Defense talk about, which is just having Huawei and other state associated companies inside our military networks in case there's some kind of conflict or conflagration. But the other is, I think, going to migrate down more to the consumer uses, because the idea would be that if China quote unquote won the 5G race, like the US won the 4G or 3G LTE standardization race, then most of the next industries would be created in China, which could mean that if you do have some kind of industrial breakthrough on the Internet of Things or machine-to-machine type of industrial activity, a lot of consumer data would flow through Chinese servers. And the question for Americans and Europeans and others is, do you trust that process, given the privacy concerns we have versus the way China conducts itself on those types of issues?
So 2 quick points. One is on these last points like 5G, Huawei, once again, this is perhaps to my mind the most complicated issue we face with China, which is there are certain reasons for strategic and other reasons we want to decouple with China, and we don't particularly want to see them advance technologically. We certainly don't want to see them advance technologically in areas where it would contribute to military power necessarily. On the other hand, we cannot be seen as trying to keep China from economically developing, which involves technological development. So how do you separate those two? That's a very, very difficult question. 5G has all kinds of implications for domestic repression, conceivably, for military uses, but it also is the next wave of development economically for societies as a whole. And so how do we deal with both interdependence and also where China is going in that realm and many other technological realms as China is catching up? That's the other issue that's come up in the last few years with China. China is no longer just catching up. China is at the frontier in many of these sectors, and that's a change. We didn't worry too much about China when we were catching up, but that's gone now in some of these sectors. They're pretty much peers. We're getting close question, I have to say, this is why I don't like the use of terms like aggression. Once you start using terms like aggression, so you start talking about China, you start talking about China and all the people in China, you start looking at people as enemies, we're back to a Cold War mentality very quickly, and I'm certainly not saying that's the case with Mr. Blumenthal, but I think in the way politics works, that is a very slippery slope. I think we have to be very, very careful distinguishing between the regime, or even parts of the regime, and the Chinese people as a whole, and even parts of the Chinese Communist Party, which are pro-reform, at least economic reform, if not political reform. And to realize this is not a monolith, this is a society made up of groups of people and factions. We don't understand it terribly well because it's not very transparent. But the worst course of action would be to paint an entire society as our enemy. And that really would take us into territory I don't think either of us want to reach.
So on that note, please join me in thanking our standing.
Yes.